Today we're going to make one very useful Spanish idea feel easy and friendly, the past perfect, especially with irregular participles. In everyday English, this is the had done, had seen, had said kind of tense. In Spanish, it's wonderfully buildable. You take a form of haber in the past, like había, habías, había, habíamos, habían, and then add a past participle. Hecho, visto, dicho, escrito, abierto, and so on. So the big pattern is había plus done. Había hecho, had done. Había visto, had seen. Había dicho, had said. Había escrito, had written. Había abierto, had opened. And here's the comforting part. With this tense, the participle does not change for the person. Hecho stays hecho. Visto stays visto. You only change haber. Había, habías, habíamos, habían. So the moving part is the helper verb, not the participle. That's a great shortcut. Let's hear a few useful ones in context. Ya había hecho café. I had already made coffee. Habían dicho la verdad. They had told the truth. Habías escrito el email. You had written the email. By the way, in everyday Spanish, people often say email, but mensaje is also common depending on context. Now let's focus on the stars of today, irregular participles. Some common ones are hecho from hacer, dicho from decir, escrito from escribir, visto from ver, puesto from poner, abierto from abrir, envuelto from volver. These are worth memorizing as a little set because they pop up all the time. A memory trick. Many regular participles end in ado or ido, like hablado, comido, vivido, but a few super common verbs are rebels, tiny grammar rebels, useful rebels, hecho, dicho, escrito, visto, puesto. If you memorize just these as a rhythm, they start to stick. Hecho, dicho, escrito, visto, puesto. Again, hecho, dicho, escrito, visto, puesto. How do you say I had done my homework in Spanish? Ya había hecho la tarea. Ya había hecho la tarea. Perfect. Notice ya often appears with this tense because we're often saying already had. Ya había hecho la tarea. Also, la tarea means homework or assignment, depending on context. Let's compare two sentences quickly. Hice la tarea means I did the homework. Ya había hecho la tarea means I had done the homework. The second one sounds like there was another past event after it. For example, cuando empezó la clase, ya había hecho la tarea. When class started, I had already done the homework. How do you say we had seen that movie in Spanish? Ya habíamos visto esa película. Ya habíamos visto esa película. Nice. Habíamos visto. That little habíamos tells you we had, and película means movie or film. If you want a slightly more casual word in some places, people also say película most of the time, so you're safe. Now, one common learner mistake, mixing up había with tenía. In English, both can feel like helper words in the past, but in Spanish, for the past perfect you need haber, not tener. So not tenía hecho in this meaning. Say, había hecho, habías visto, habían dicho. Let's build another one. How do you say she had opened the door in Spanish? Había abierto la puerta. Había abierto la puerta. Exactly. Abierto is one of those useful irregulars. And here's a little side note. Puerta is feminine, so la puerta. Nice and simple. Try this idea in a mini scene. Hacía frío y había abierto la ventana. It was cold, and she had opened the window. Wait, that was a bad life choice. Useful grammar, questionable judgment. Now, another frequent irregular. Decir becomes dicho. That one is gold, because saying and telling come up constantly. How do you say they had said no in Spanish? Habían dicho que no. Habían dicho que no. Good. Habían dicho que no. Literally, they had said that no, but in natural English, they had said no. That little que is very common after decir. You'll hear things like dijo que sí, said yes, or dijo que venía, said he was coming. Now let's add escrito from escribir, very useful for messages, notes, emails, and homework. How do you say, had you written the message in Spanish? ¿Habías escrito el mensaje? ¿Habías escrito el mensaje? Excellent. That's a question, and your voice rises naturally. ¿Habías escrito el mensaje? In spoken Spanish, the subject pronoun is still usually unnecessary. You don't need tú here because habías already tells us you. Here's another key tip. The past perfect often appears with words like ya, todavía no, cuando, antes de que, and por qué. For example, cuando llamaste, ya había salido. When you called, I had already left. Todavía no había visto eso. I still hadn't seen that. No había puesto la mesa porque estaba cansado. I hadn't set the table because I was tired. Puesto. Another important irregular. Poner becomes puesto. Think of poner as put and puesto as put or placed in this structure. How do you say he had put the keys on the table in Spanish? Había puesto las llaves en la mesa. Había puesto las llaves en la mesa. Very nice. Las llaves means the keys. Singular is la llave, the key. Handy word, unless you've lost them. Let's make the pattern feel automatic. I'll give you the infinitive, and you think of the irregular participle. Hacer becomes hecho. Decir becomes dicho. Escribir becomes escrito. Ver becomes visto. Poner becomes puesto. Abrir becomes abierto. Volver becomes vuelto. Vuelto means returned or come back. For example, ya había vuelto a casa. I had already returned home. How do you say, I had already returned home in Spanish? Ya había vuelto a casa. Ya había vuelto a casa. Beautiful. A casa means home when you're talking about going or returning home. Not usually la casa there, just a casa. Now let's talk about a second common mistake. Learners sometimes use the wrong participle after haber. For regular verbs, yes, hablado, comido, vivido. But with these common irregulars, don't say he sido or dicido for had said. It must be hecho, dicho. These forms are not optional. They are the form. And one more useful point. In this lesson, we're using the past perfect with haber plus participle. Don't worry about making the participle match gender or number here. You say, había escrito la carta, and habían escrito las cartas. Escrito stays escrito. Same form. Let's hear a little story. Llegué al cine tarde, pero mis amigos ya habían visto el comienzo. I arrived at the cinema late, but my friends had already seen the beginning. Yo no había comprado palomitas, so I had no popcorn, which is obviously the true tragedy. Then Ana me dijo que ya había puesto mi entrada en su bolso. Anna told me she had already put my ticket in her bag. Notice that chain of past events? That's exactly where this tense shines. How do you say, we had said the truth in Spanish? Better yet, the natural phrase is, we had told the truth.
Habíamos dicho la verdad.
Habíamos dicho la verdad. Great. La verdad is the truth. Very common phrase. How do you say, I had seen your message in Spanish? Había visto tu mensaje. Había visto tu mensaje. Perfect. Tu mensaje. Your message. At A2 level, this is exactly the kind of sentence you can start using right away in real conversations. Now a quick pattern recap. To say had done something in Spanish, use haber in the imperfect plus the participle. had done, había hecho, had said, había dicho, had written, había escrito, had seen, había visto, had opened, había abierto, had put, había puesto, had returned, había vuelto. If you want the person to change, just swap the haber form. I had done, había hecho. You had done, habías hecho. We had done, habíamos hecho. They had done, habían hecho. Nice and clean. Let's do a final wave of quick ones together. How do you say they had opened the windows in Spanish? Habían abierto las ventanas. Habían abierto las ventanas. How do you say we had written everything in Spanish? Habíamos escrito todo. Habíamos escrito todo. Habíamos escrito todo. How do you say she had seen my book in Spanish? Había visto mi libro. Había visto mi libro. Excellent work. Today you practiced a tense that can sound advanced at first, but the core idea is actually very manageable. Had plus done in English becomes había, habías, habíamos, habían plus a participle in Spanish. And for the most common irregulars, keep your little power list close. Hecho, dicho, escrito, visto, puesto, abierto, vuelto. If you remember just one thing from today, remember this. Only haber changes. The participle stays put. Había hecho. Habías hecho. Habíamos hecho. That one pattern unlocks a lot. You're building real Spanish now, the kind that helps you tell stories, explain what happened before, and sound more natural. So if this felt like a lot, that's okay. Repeat the rhythm a few times later. Hecho, dicho, escrito, visto, puesto, abierto, vuelto. Your brain loves patterns, especially slightly dramatic ones. Keep going. Ya habías aprendido mucho antes de terminar esta lección. You had already learned a lot before finishing this lesson.